Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Marianne, for the excellent introduction. Thank you to Maartje and the CODART team for having me here and for organizing this nice conference. And thank you to the Royal Museum and its fine arts and the KMSKA for hosting this event, and congratulations with the reopening. After more than a decade of renovation, KMSKA has finally reopened its doors. It is the largest museum of the Flemish community and has a rich and diverse collection, but with a focus on Flemish art from the 15th to the 21st century. The museum aims to be a showcase, I think, for the artistic and creative output of the small, prosperous, and today highly autonomous region in the southern Netherlands that we call Flanders. Like many other regions and states, Flanders likes to mirror its past, and especially to its artistic past. Today's Flanders likes to see itself as a crossroads in Europe, an innovative and open region, an economically strong expert nation. For that constructed and cherished self-image, Flanders thinks to find without little difficulty a foreshadowing in its own rich artistic past. A past wherein, in inverted commas, Flemish art and artists not only set the tone locally, but were also and preeminently an export product. In the last decade, work has been done to put the term Flemish masters more on the map, essentially to promote tourism and to market Flanders as a cultural destination. Of course, clichés could not be avoided. Jan van Eyck and the Flemish primitives taught Europe to paint with oils, Bruegel glorifying abundant rural life, and Rubens as the quintessence of Baroque, and so on. As a marketing tool, this concept does its job. And broadly speaking, the repeatedly regurgitated narrative seems to be true. But looking with the eye of the critical scholar and curator, one sees a much more diverse and nuanced historical reality, broader and richer, perhaps, and more complex than suspected. In a larger perspective, it is immediately striking how strongly the nationalistic views of 19th century still defines the public and even to some extent the academic image of this art history. 19th and 20th century nationalism, which used or rather misused Herder's concept Volksgeist, Volksaard we should say in Flemish, has had a profound influence on the thinking and art historiography of the 19th and early 20th century. The devotional and realistic, at the same time rich Burgundian splendor of the world of the Flemish primitives, the golden shine and narrative details of the pre-Reformation carved and gilded altarpieces, the dancing and dragging peasants in Breugel's works, the abundance and pathos of Roman Catholic life in Rubens' altar and history paintings populated with voluptuous women. The profusion of kitchen scenes and still lifes from Beukelaar to Snijders and beyond. The focus on still life, landscape, portrait, and genre piece. They all define the supposed unique character of Flemish art. What does not fit into that picture often remains underexposed and excluded from the canon altogether. In the not-so-old historiography and art criticism, the work of Flemish masters adapting to a foreign Italian or French style was fittingly dismissed as bastard art, alien to the Flemish spirit. Nationalistic views have left deep marks right down to our contemporary understanding of what Flemish art is and what Flemishness means or should mean. Expansionists are just reductive. What is Flemish or who is Flemish is either taken broadly or defined narrowly. Of course, the historical concept of Flemish or Fleming or Flemish, Fiamingo, Flamenco, Fleming, Flamand does not coincide at all with today's definition of this region. Flemish people of the time, Flemish artists could be Dutch, but also French-speaking, or rather Picard or Walloon, or speak a Low German dialect. The term Fleming, Fiamingo, usually encompassed all the people of the Low Countries in its broadest sense. Research in recent decades also consistently shows that certainly abroad and in the context of art, until the 18th century, little distinction was made between the southern and northern Netherlands. Only afterwards, and especially in the 19th century, did Flemish and Dutch become two distinct concepts and schools, with the accompanying cliched contrasts we all know. In the wake of Vasari, or rather Van Mander, Flemish art is also usually associated exclusively with painting. Sculpture, architecture, and the other so-called applied or decorative arts are barely discussed, or only when they relate to painters and their inventio. There is also a fixation on the individual artist's personality, the notion of a master, which is almost always male. Much art destined for expert, like prints or mass-produced paintings, mostly do not fit under the heading Old Master Painting, and perhaps that is why in the past it has not always received the attention it deserved. The cases I present here do not aim to be comprehensive or representative in any way, nor can it be within the limited time I have here. The topic is vast, and its boundaries not always clear. I deliberately highlighted certain aspects to challenge the traditional image of Flemish art in an international situation, and also to put into perspective the intrinsically problematic nature of something labeled as Flemish art. Paintings and their makers have become Flanders' best-known export product. From the late 14th century, Flemish artists started traveling and regularly obtained prestigious commissions from foreign princes, nobles, patricians, abbeys, or churches. I can be very brief about this here, because the examples are legion, and certainly known by you. The subject has been well researched in recent decades, and And it has been the subject of many meritorious studies and exhibitions. Just to see a few here on the screen. So today I will not discuss Portinari, the Bentvogels, or Bamboccianti in Rome, or François Duquesnoy. I will also leave alone cloth painting exports to Spain, Portugal, and Southern Europe, nor do I say anything about the Horenbouts or Marcus Gerards and Van Dyck in England, or the beautiful music-making angels in this museum that Memling painted to the beat of a Spanish church. I will at most let the instruments speak. Flemish or broadly Netherlandish artists in France, in Paris, caught my attention. Especially with the nearby France, the borders have long been unclear and quite transparent. What belongs to the Flemish school and what does not? It is an issue that seems less important today than a century ago in a nationalist atmosphere when the primitif flamand were played off against the primitif français, amongst others. The contacts are much deeper, more complex, older and broader. But the example of the crucifixion of the Parliament of Paris, it is very close to Rogiers van der Weyden's art, shows how difficult it still is to deal with the sometimes imposed national labels for schools. The work has been attributed to the master of Dreux-Budé, who can probably be identified with André Diepré, a Flemish painter. The Louvre website also underlines that provenance and the Flemish character of the work. but it's still labeled there as École Française. This is strange here because the work does connect very closely with what we see as archetypal Flemish art. Still today, there seems to be a pronounced demand to label everything against all trends, neatly old-fashioned national. The political structure of nation-states and regions seems deeply embedded in our being, despite the European Union we have today. We are constantly reminded that historical reality had little to do with nation concepts formed in the 19th century. A stylistic definition of the distinct schools is usually older, but therefore not always clear. An example that demonstrates this well is Philippe de Champaigne. He was born and trained as a painter in Brussels, but became one of the leading painters in Paris in the mid-17th century. Traditionally, we associated his work with the typical French classicism of the time. However, his large oeuvre is very broad and does show the impact of Flemish training, from the Rubens-influenced altarpieces of his early period to the sober Jansenist-influenced ex-voto with nuns of Port-Royal later in his career. We see here the Rubens altarpiece, I think, in the St. Paul's Church, and on the other side, a very resembling version by Philippe de Champaigne. And here are the nuns of Port-Royal. The lure of Paris and the French court has been very strong over the centuries, but the unfavorable economic and political situation in the southern Netherlands from the late 16th century onwards makes it even stronger, resulting in the migration of many artists. Moreover, the French kings gradually create a kind of French royal state style that will become dominant, eventually in all of Europe. Among the 12 founding members of the Academy in Paris were two artists from the Low Countries, Justus van Egmond and the sculptor Antwerp-born Gérard van Opstal. Numerous others joined afterwards, including the aforementioned de Champaigne. Typically, the Flemish there were known for portraits, still lifes, and landscapes, such as the topographical renderings of battles painted by the Brussels-born Jan Frans van der Meulen for Louis XIV himself. In history painting, Rubens' royal commissions and other paintings, including the Medici cycle, but also his prints, continued to set the tone for a long time in the French capital. The infamous battle between the Rubinist and Poussinist shows how great his impact and the impact of Flemish art was there. The seamless integration of Flemish artists and their works in their new environment sometimes makes us forget how wide-ranging the phenomenon of artist migration and art export has been. Yet many Flemish artists and artisans did contribute to French art and French savoir-faire, especially in areas in which they traditionally excelled. For instance, dyeing wool and silk, weaving tapestries. Marc de Comans et François de la Planche, alias Marc Komans and Frans van der Planken, from Antwerp and Kortrijk respectively, were brought to Paris to weave tapestries à la façon de Flandre, under royal protection. Out of this grew the famous Manufacture des Gobelins. In the field of printmaking too, Flemings paved the way for the Grand Siècle in Paris. The Antwerp native Edelink, for example, Edelinck, I should say, was perhaps the most important and influential engraver in Paris in his time. Earlier, Flemish engravers and print publishers had already been active in Paris, and we see here a portrait of the Brussels-born de Champaigne engraved by Edelink, and we see that he represented the towers of his native city in the background, so clearly acknowledging his Flemish, his Brussels background. But mostly the practitioners of arts and crafts, such as tapestry weavers and wood carvers, who worked in the later 17th and 18th centuries in France and elsewhere in the so-called Louis styles, then prevalent throughout Europe, such as the celebrated Antwerp-born carver of boiseries Verbergt, are almost namelessly and unidentifiably hidden behind the goût français. This is different for tapestries, for which a number of Flemish and Brabant towns were known for centuries, and in which a style of their own was developed, admittedly with important Italian influences in the 16th century and French ones in the later 17th and 18th century. Today, the medium has had a hard time getting into the spotlight because they are rather unevenly represented in museums, but also because there are significant challenges and constraints associated with moving or displaying this art. From a financial point of view, the hugely expensive tapestries made in the southern Netherlands were among the region's main exports for centuries. The mobile fresco of the north was also very important from an art historical point of view. Yet permanent museum displays of Flemish tapestries are rather the exception. Many exceptional series have been lost or fragmented over the centuries. Some very large collections of princely origin or royal origin hardly find space to display or exchange the monumental pieces. For instance, Madrid and Vienna have by far, I think, the largest collections of Flemish tapestries. Partly because of the major logistical and curatorial challenges, exhibitions around Flemish tapestries remain a relatively rarity. The exceptional technical and artistic quality of these works and the names of designers such as Van Orley, Coxey, and Pieter Koeke van Aalst are still not very well known to a wider public today, although their works were recently the subject of important exhibitions based on new research. Prints were a medium largely destined for export. The scope, quality, iconographic, and artistic breadth of the prints published in Antwerp in the period 1550-1650, roughly, has only recently come into good focus. This is in large part the merit of the New Holstein series and its tireless compilers, who were inspired and spurred on by our good friend Ger Luiten, who passed away from us far too soon last December. Unlike the extremely exclusive tapestries and expensive paintings, prints were affordable to a much wider audience. Moreover, they ended up in just about every corner of the known world. The ornament and architectural language of Cornelis Floris or Hans Vredeman de Vries, which we see here, for example, had much more impact through this route than through the traveling of artists or finished works of art themselves. Deep into the 17th century, it made itself felt in just about all of Northern Europe, from Ireland to Poland and from Sweden to Hungary. Religious prints based on designs by painters such as Maarten de Vos and Rubens reached Latin America and South Asia via missions. The cultural transfers these representations underwent are also the subject of recent research and publications by scholars as Daan van Hees, Stephanie Porras, and Aaron Hyman. Hopefully, someone will soon take up the challenge of turning this research into exhibitions as well. Through the diversions of printmaking, light has also been shed on the works of Stradanus. Giovanni Stradano, alias Jan van der Straat from Bruges, spent most of his life in Florence, where he was court painter to the Medici alongside and after Vasari. His painted oeuvre, often preserved in situ, is very Italian and was always outside the traditional scope of the Flemish school. Like the art of his contemporary Gian Bologna, a native of Douai in French Flanders and trained in Antwerp, It once again shows the protean skills of Flemish artists to adapt to different demands and styles. Stradanus designed hundreds of prints, often with unusual themes such as hunting scenes or new discoveries, all of which were made at the request of Antwerp publishers and were thus highly influential because of their worldwide distribution. Numerous other Flemish designers, engravers, and print publishers became active abroad, by necessity or otherwise. Several members of the Sadeler dynasty, originating from Brussels and Antwerp, played an important role in the European print market from the Austro-Habsburg territories. A strong interaction with the Netherlands, where many designers and engravers working for them were active, remained. The Mannerist art that flourished particularly at the courts of Vienna, Munich, but especially Prague under Rudolf II, was strongly inspired by Italian examples, but was largely the work of Flemings, Netherlandish artists, who gave it their own face. I think few associated the work of, for instance, Bartholomeus Spranger, a native of Antwerp, or Peter Candid, alias De Witte, from Bruges, with Flemish art today. Mannerism has long been not very popular and answers very poorly to the criteria of Flemishness. Joris Hoefnagel, an erudite from a wealthy Antwerp merchant family, ended up at court in Munich and later Vienna, where he was active as an illuminator. He was a late practitioner of illuminated manuscript and an early practitioner of the cabinet miniature, two other typical export products from Flanders. Hoefnagel's complex artist personality cannot be grasped here in the short time I was allowed, but for several reasons, he is a key cultural and art historical figure. Briefly, I would describe him as the personification of the Kunst- und Wunderkammer culture of that time. His long, unjustly forgotten work belongs in the CODART canon, actually in any canon, perhaps represented by this intriguing work in our collection in Brussels. To crown the work of the Flemings in Prague, one may very appropriately place the emperor's crown of Rudolf II, Jan Vermeyen, made by Jan Vermeyen, a Brussels-born artist of Dutch extraction. With its delicate reliefs and fine animal work, it certainly ranks among the absolute masterpieces of the goldsmith's art of that time. Which brings me to another forgotten expert, which certainly played a major role in 16th century Antwerp: jewelry, precious metal work, weapons, and armor. The role of Flanders and Antwerp in particular in this has long remained under the radar, although there were important clues via archival records, provenances, and preserved prints and drawings. This design for a Nautilus cup was only recently attributed to Peter Cook. I think it was attributed to Holbein before, suggesting that design and production must have been significant here in the Low Countries. After all, much precious metal work was melted down, certainly from the earlier periods, or accidentally ended up in another context in which its origin is difficult to trace. But orders also sometimes came from unexpected quarters. For instance, Francis I ordered large quantities of monumental, precious metalwork from the Antwerp dealer in luxury goods Joris Vezelaar, the grandfather of the aforementioned Hoefnagel. The fact that the French king sometimes ignored the celebrated Parisian silversmiths will not only have had to do with the quality of the work, because Vezelaar himself pre-financed and coordinated and probably placed orders with several silversmiths in different cities in the area, he was able to deliver large numbers of high-quality pieces quickly and in very short time. That innovative way of organizing and financing were important elements in the international success of Flemish art and luxury goods also remains a rather underexposed issue. But to return to the goldsmith's works, little of it has survived. The St. Michael's cup shown here escaped remelting because it ended up in Vienna as a diplomatic gift. That the links between Antwerp and Paris, for instance, to return to that, were more intense and complex than originally suspected is also shown by the case of Elysius Libars. Not very long ago, his name could be linked to shields and parade armor which he supplied to the King of Sweden, among others, and which are among the finest work made in this genre at the time. Meanwhile, more work has been attributed to him. However, the embossed decorative schemes are very French in a style traditionally attributed to the engraver Étienne de Laune. However, the latter's oeuvre appears to be based on the designs of a forgotten Parisian painter and book illuminator, Baptiste Pellerin. By what routes his designs ended up in Antwerp and were executed there remains an open question. Finding those answers, constantly questioning our knowledge, delving into collections and presenting stories, and offering these to a public, I think, is the task of the scholar and the curator. I hope I have been able to show here today that the story of the export of Flemish art and artists, or rather Flemish art in an international context, is much more multifaceted and complex as we think. Difficult to read and less uniform than expected. That Flemish art and its supposed Flemishness are extremely relative, elastic concepts, which presumably say more about themselves and the context in which they arose than about what they are supposed to encompass and to describe. I hope this insight will not deter you, however, from enjoying the collection of this museum, which, although now beautifully remodeled and presented differently, was originally conceived as a showcase of Flemish art as a manifestation of the Flemish spirit as it was seen in the 19th century. Thank you very much.